Wonderful. Well, I might get started purely because we have a lot to get through today. And I know we only have 60 minutes with you all. So we're going to use all that time as much as possible. And we'll also make sure we'll make some time for questions at the end. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the US recruitment opportunity, what Australian and New Zealand universities need to know. Before I start, though, I do want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as traditional custodians of the land where I'm joining you from today in Sydney. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. For those that don't know me, my name is Rebecca Bendall, and I'm the Executive Director for Australia and New Zealand, and I've worked very closely with Acumen over the past few years. And for those that don't know Acumen, just a quick intro about us. We essentially help institutions enter, explore, and expand into new markets. And that could be through in-country representation, it could be through our T&E consulting, it also could be through our enrolment solutions. We do this around the world, but specifically we do focus on Southeast Asia, South Asia, UK, and North America. So we're very pleased to welcome you all today. So over the past year or two, a few words have dominated many conversations I've had with universities. Two words specifically come to mind, I think, are diversity and quality. Whether it's the changing government policy, enrolment limits, involving visa settings, financial pressures, student stickiness, or simply reducing reliance on a handful of source markets, institutions are increasingly asking questions around what the next sustainable growth opportunity might be. Now, traditionally, when we think about the United States, and when I say we, I think about Australia and New Zealand, we think of it as one of our competitors for international students. We don't often think of it as a recruitment market in its own right. And that is demonstrated through the small numbers that get recruited. But what happens if that assumption is no longer entirely true? The US market is changing with domestic tuition costs continue to rise. Student priorities are changing with the political and social factors, influencing decision-making ways we've never seen before. Recent surveys are showing 63% of young Americans are wishing to leave the US. And more American students are beginning to consider full degree study overseas, with some of our UK competitors are experiencing 20 to 40% growth from the US. Now, both Australia and New Zealand offer many of the things that US students are increasingly seeking: world-class education, globally recognised qualifications, a safe and welcoming environment, and a clear pathway between education and career. But what I also know is that recruiting students from the US has not always been easy. It is a highly relationship-driven market. Student expectations are very different. The admissions journey looks different. There isn't an established agent ecosystem in the way that many of us are familiar with, and success requires a very different approach. That's exactly why today I bring together two of my wonderful colleagues, Katie Landrey and Damian Barnes. Now, Katie is our Director of Partner Success and combines a background in student success and higher education leadership with hands-on experience supporting universities to recruit in one of the world's most complex and relationship-driven markets. She is exceptionally well placed to help us understand not what's changing in the US, but also what it means for institutions in Australia and New Zealand. And Damian is Acumen's Partner Success Manager for North America. Damian works directly with our university partners in our in-country representation teams across the US, helping institutions translate market insights into practical recruitment activities. With a background spanning higher education, student development, and campus recruitment, Damian brings a unique perspective on how universities can build meaningful engagement and sustainable recruitment pipelines. Damian will also be attending AIEC in Sydney, so if you wanted the chance to meet with him in person, please make sure you reach out. As I mentioned at the start, we will have time for questions. Please answer your questions in the Q&A function area. And now over to you, Damian.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Sharing is not turned on. Give me 1 second. Ayushi, can you allow me to share my screen?
Always fun when we start a webinar with a little technical error.
Always great. Mhm. 1 second. Yes, I need host to allow me to share. One second. Hmm. Beck, could you share your screen possibly?
I don't have access at the moment. Just give me 1 second. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be with you one moment. Damien, if you just wanted to start off by talking through what we're going to cover off today. In the meantime, Katie and I will work on getting these slides up for you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank
All right. So Katie and I are really excited to dive into the US market with you today. Over the next hour or so, we're going to cover how this market actually works and how and what has changed in student sentiment over the past 18 months, what that enrollment data is already showing, and what that means for institutions in Australia and New Zealand. Before we get started, just two quick housekeeping notes. So Katie and I will both be going back and forth with presenting, but also we will both be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. So if we mention anything you would like us to unpack further, please drop it in the chat and we will address it as we go. Um, and we are also setting time aside for questions at the end, like Beck mentioned. Um,
you.
and then,
We are good to share. Thanks, Damien.
okay, amazing. I will share in a second. All right, now we're in business. Um, just to show you the overview again of sort of what I just addressed, is on this screen. Um, and then next, so to give a quick picture of who we are, this map is our footprint. With more than 40 in-country staff across 14 US states. It's a network that Katie and I manage together day to day. Each of our representatives work on behalf of their university partners from the UK, Europe, and recruit students across North America. Day to day, what that looks like is building relationships with school counselors, independent consultants, and community college. Um, we'll get more into community colleges later in the presentation. But really, what it comes down to is raising brand awareness for their institutions, and feeding market intelligence back to their partner university. And this is all fully compliant with US admission ethics. The reason I want to highlight this map is that the US relationship is a relationship market. There is no agent channel here, and Katie will touch more on that shortly. And success in this market comes from having people who show up in person year after year, and that is exactly what this network represents. Before we get into the market itself, I want to share a quick example of what success can look like in this market. So, a London-based Russell Group University partnered with us to build out their North American recruitment, where they deployed two in-country representatives. In their first year, undergraduate applications increased 78% and postgraduate applications rose to 39%. What I found to be the most valuable part of this story is that in fall of 2024, the university shifted its priorities and asked us to place additional emphasis on postgraduate recruitment from the US. So the model was adapted and postgraduate enrollment grew 27% in a single cycle. After this, we were able to keep that momentum into fall 2026 intake, which is tracking up 8% in applications and 16% in deposits right now, while undergraduate enrollment still grew 40% from 2024 to 2025. So the two takeaways I would like to highlight is first is that in-country presence converts in this market at rates that even has surprised a lot of our partners. And second, we can flex the model when your strategy changes. So keep this case in mind as we go, because everything we're about to cover is the context this university used to make those numbers happen. Now I'll pass it to Katie.
Thanks, Damian. Before we jump too far into the US recruitment landscape overview, we wanted to start by talking about some key differences between the US higher education sector in comparison to other international markets. So I'll highlight some of these quite quickly, and a lot of these we will go into more depth in as we continue to talk about the market in more detail. But first, we wanted to highlight that undergraduate programs are typically 4 years, and postgraduate programs are typically 2 to 3 years, which for many of the markets we currently recruit for, such as the UK and Ireland, these are longer program lengths than a typical undergraduate degree, for example, in the UK. The United States, as Damien mentioned, is not an agent-driven market, and so relationships have to be built directly with the high school counselors, independent education counselors, fellowship advisors, or other university stakeholders to drive recruitment. And so our team on the ground are managing those relationships directly, as well as working one-to-one with the students throughout the entire recruitment cycle. Similarly, the postgraduate space is also driven by relationship management rather than by comprehensive recruitment events. And so while there are some postgraduate recruitment fairs, they tend to be disproportionately more expensive than the undergraduate recruitment events, which hit operating budgets harder. So as a lot of our university partners are navigating the space with limited ops budgets at the moment, we're finding that they're really focusing on the relationship-driven model versus using those fairs that tend to be, like I said, quite a bit more expensive. Federal funding from the US can be applied to eligible international universities, but we are going to get into the details during this presentation about how federal funding has recently changed under the administration and some of the new limitations that have gone into effect that are impacting how international students can position themselves, or international universities can position themselves in the market. And historically, the US is not traditionally an outbound market, which means our international recruiters have to begin conversations earlier and are often starting a few steps back, having conversations with students about whether or not they've even left the US before they really get into conversations around what the university itself can have to offer. And lastly, I just want to touch on the fact that the domestic admissions process really does impact student expectation around test policies and the high touch nature of what they expect admissions to look like across international universities as well. So you'll notice in this section, as we talk about the recruitment landscape, we will touch on some examples from domestic institutions, because at this point, we do still think it's incredibly important because it sets the expectation for prospective students about what they expect throughout admissions processes.
Some. So let's talk federal aid. As I would assume many of you have questions on this, I want to remind everyone to freely ask them in the chat, and Katie will do her best to answer as many as we can. So FAFSA, for those unfamiliar, FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. It's the form American students complete to apply federal financial aid. So in short, completing a FAFSA is simply how students access their federal aid. It doesn't mean your institution is participating in the program. The institutional side is separate. Title IX eligibility is the certification that allows non-US universities to receive US federal loans. The important limitation is that only federal loans can be used abroad. Grant funding never leaves the United States. And as of 2 weeks ago, federal loans for most postgraduate students are capped. More on that later. So now the question we're asked the most is, how do we recruit US students without loan eligibility? Well, I'm happy to answer that question. So first, the students you recruit without US federal aid are typically self-funded, able to document their finances, and genuinely committed to studying elsewhere. So you know your own visa risk framework better than I do. So that is exactly the type of student that is designed to reward, especially as many traditional source markets have moved into higher evidence requirements. Second, the US financial aid system is under increased strain and to be quite frank, having some reliability issues. So through the current administration, the Department of Education has lost half of its staff, and its responsibilities have been distributed across four federal agencies. And 59% of American institutions report problems processing financial aid. So whatever you're competing against, it isn't a system operating at its best at the moment. Third, eligibility can cost more than it delivers. So one Australian university found that it was spending the equivalent of nearly half a full-time position and about $53,000 US each year to give aid to just 10 to 12 students. On top of that, US regulations prohibit institutions from promoting their participation as a marketing advantage. So you're paying for a benefit you're not even allowed to advertise. So that university ultimately chose to withdraw, which made financial sense for them. And then finally, price certainty is a huge competitive advantage in the US. So the average discount rate for US private colleges is now at 57%, which means sticker prices rarely reflect what families actually pay. Most students don't know their true costs until months into their admissions process, where you can provide that exact cost in a single email. So most institutions cannot replicate that. So the absence of FAFSA isn't a weakness in your offer. It's actually more of a removal of what a lot of students consider to be the most frustrating part of the American admissions process. Now let's talk about testing. These are US standardized tests. So the SAT and the ACT, and then plus AP, which stands for Advanced Placement, which are college level courses taken during high school. When it comes to standardized testing, as you know, depending on the region, some tests matter more than others. And what makes the US interesting is how divided it is. Testing here is not dead by any means. Requirements are actually ticking back up, and a handful of elite institutions have reinstated them, and scores are still drive merit scholarships. So if you ask American applicants for scores, you are in step with where part of the U.S. market itself is heading, and a strong SAT and AP result is generally a good and useful sign. The reason this slide shows participation rates and is not to talk you out of testing, it's to show why flexibility in your requirements really matters. So an example is one of our university partners used to accept only AP scores from American applicants as a hard requirement. It was reasonable on paper because APs are rigorous and they map well for entry standards. But the problem was that fewer than 40% of American graduates take a single AP exam. So that one line in their entry criteria was quietly screening out more than half of the American market before anyone read an application, including plenty of strong students whose schools simply just didn't push or pushed a SAT or ACT instead. And that's the real takeaway from these numbers. Roughly half of the graduates have SAT scores, about a third have ACT, and just over a third have AP. So any single required test excludes most of the market. So the solution is not lowering your standards, it's just accepting multiple routes to the same standard. So if a student has an ACT, SAT, or AP score, take them. If they don't, look at the transcript, the grades they earned, and how rigorous their coursework was. And Katie will show you in a few slides that this is exactly how the US universities themselves read applications, so it will feel familiar to your applicants as well. Now let's put this size of the market into perspective. Um, in the fall, 19.4 million students were enrolled in US higher education, which is an increase of 1% over the previous year. Community colleges accounted for nearly all of that growth, with private four-year institutions actually seeing a little bit of a decline. And again, we'll get into more into community colleges later in the presentation, because there's a much bigger opportunity than a lot of international recruitment teams realize. The figures on the right are where almost every conversation with American families eventually ends up, and that is cost. So average tuition at private university is just under $45,000 per year, and that's before adding nearly $14,000 US for room and board. That puts the total cost of a four-year private degree close to a quarter million US dollars. And you can compare those numbers to your own tuition faster than I can. Um, and that comparison becomes even more compelling when you add the fact that it takes only 3 years to complete your degree as opposed to four. So you're asking students to pay for one less year of tuition while entering the workforce 1 year earlier. So doing the math on that really checks out. And then the sort of elephant in the room, I'm sure some of you have heard the term enrollment cliff. That cliff is real. American high school graduates peaked this year at 3.9 million and will decline gradually over the next 15 years due to birth rates falling after the 2008 recession. However, the bigger story for you all is a greater share of each generation is choosing higher education. So around 38% of American adults now hold a bachelor's degree, and among 25 to 34-year-olds, 56% hold sort of some type of credential, which is the highest rate ever recorded in America. So even as the population has shrunk, the net number of students entering the system is holding up very well. So the cliff, although it has raised a lot of concern, it is not the reason to avoid the market. What does it do is it has made it more competitive, but at the same time, like I mentioned, the market is steady as more students are looking to go into higher education.
Thanks, Damien.
Yes.
We're going to pivot to talk a little bit more about market challenges and some of the factors we think that international universities should be considering as they're putting together their plans and their strategies for entering the US market. So, we're going to touch on a few different challenges that we think will impact international universities playing in this space. The first is that there's been a lot of expansion around direct admissions programs in the US. And so we're seeing domestic universities offer admissions to their programs at both public and private institutions. A few examples of this is that the Texas state system, for example, grants admission to any student who finishes in the top 10% of their high school class, which is required by state law that those institutions must grant those offers. Similarly, Indiana recently introduced what they call the Enrollment Honors Plus Diploma, which automatically grants admission to the state's 7 public colleges. So we're seeing this happen at a state level as well as an institution level. We're also seeing that certain universities have gotten incredibly creative with how they offer direct admission, and Western New England offered, for example, admission to over 2,000 students before they even applied to the institution based on their test scores from ACT courses, SAT, and AP courses. And of those students that they offered to, about 12% accepted that offer, even though they had not previously applied to the university. So we're seeing that these programs do generate increased enrollment for universities. And what this means for international universities is that students that they may be targeting, especially those high performing and high achieving students, often have offers in hand, even potentially from universities they haven't considered or haven't applied to. And so effective recruitment in this market is really about removing as many barriers for admission as possible because students will have those other offers in domestic universities that are getting quite creative in how to recruit students. They're also seeing, and we're also seeing an increase in free tuition programs. Again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail when it comes to the community college space and why we see that space growing, because there are a number of states that are offering free tuition at community colleges to their in-state students. But we're also seeing this across Ivy and flagship institutions. So Harvard, for example, has recently launched a free tuition program for families earning less than 200,000 USD per year. And they're offering additional support, including housing and food cost coverage for families earning under 100,000. And so for our global top 100 universities who are competing for that same subset of students in the States as our Ivy League institutions in the US, there is a lot of financial challenge. We're also noting this because a misconception about the US is that students don't require scholarship or financial aid to the same extent as other markets. But because our US institutions are setting the bar so high about the financial packages they offer students, it still tends to be an expectation for students in this market, regardless of family income. While we mentioned previously that our undergraduate degrees are typically 4 years long, we are seeing more and more institutions start to explore offering 3-year degree programs so that they can compete with international universities that are able to offer similar programs in shorter times, and also so students can cut down on tuition costs as we're becoming an increasingly price-sensitive market, especially with some of our economic changes and policy changes over the last 2 years since our change in administration. Lastly, we are seeing a significant increase in competitive conversion tactics, both from domestic universities but international universities as well. One example I want to highlight is that the University of Manchester recently implemented a program where they'll reimburse a deposit a student has made to a competitor university if the student changes their mind and chooses instead to attend the University of Manchester. This is incredibly important for the US because it helps the University of Manchester remain competitive after the May 1 domestic deadline in the States, where students have to commit to an undergraduate program by May 1 if they're choosing to potentially consider domestic degrees as well as international degrees. And like I said, domestic universities are also relying heavily on both scholarship, but also what we call tuition discounting. So while the US is often perceived as that high net worth market, scholarships really will still matter for conversion because of the expectations set by the domestic admissions processes. I touched briefly on the domestic deadlines, but I do want to highlight this here, and then Damian will cover this in a bit more detail about how this relates to Australia timelines and typical New Zealand timelines. For the undergraduate sector, the US runs on the May 1 decision deadline, which essentially means that students in the States must deposit at a domestic university by May 1 to seal their offer and hold their spot at a university. Increasingly, we're seeing students commit to actually more than one university and potentially put deposits down at multiple universities to give themselves more time in the future to make that decision over the summer. I also want to flag on the undergraduate side, we have what's called our early decision timelines. And so there's both early action and early decision, which offers start sooner, and students actually could be making decisions on universities as early as December. And so that decision timeline on the undergraduate side is locked in. And so for universities that don't consider that timeline, and so for example, for universities that don't get offers out ahead of that May 1 deadline, they're putting themselves at a disadvantage because students will have already committed. While the postgraduate side is a bit more flexible, I do want to flag that the April 15th resolution is an agreement across many graduate schools, though not all in the States, that they have to provide applicants updates by April 15th so that students can make their decision by mid-April. So even though this isn't as set a deadline as May 1 is for undergraduate students, we are seeing this become an increasingly popular timeline for the postgraduate side. And again, do recommend that universities are considering this when they're making their offers and comparing their timelines to the US timeline.
Awesome. So now let's just put the calendars side by side, because I believe this can be one of the biggest structural advantages you have in this market. Um, on the US side, like Katie mentioned, applications open in August of the final year of high school. Uh, Binding early decisions are due in November. Regular deadline run through March. Decision day is on May 1st. And there's a single intake in late August. So that's 15 months from first application to first class. So it's one door once a year. On your side, with two intakes, with rolling applications and typically 2 to 4 months from application to enrollment. On top of that, American students graduate high school in May and June. So your semester two intake opens in late July. That means the US student can walk across the graduation stage and then be enrolled with you just a few weeks later, with no gap year, which a lot of students would actually love to make the quick jump in this market. The US cannot offer that level of speed, and neither can the UK or Canadian universities whose September cycles sort of mirror the American one. So you're really the only major destination in the calendar that can welcome students mid-cycle. Um, it also works as two doors, so the students who want their summer or needs time to save can take February intake and graduate in June. So they can still keep the whole summer if they like, work through the fall, and start in February. So it becomes more of a gap semester rather than a gap year, where July door serves as the opposite for students, the one who wants to shut out in the March decision round or whose postgraduate funding was suddenly capped, and who does not want to lose a year, they also have that option. So it gives you all a great versatility in the American market.
This next bit tends to be an advantage for our international institutions across recruitment in the States, but we did want to highlight how we tend to see admissions processes vary between US domestic admissions and international admissions processes. So, the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, or NACAC for short, released survey results a few years ago which showcased how application readers for US universities were ranking application materials in the decision-making process. And these results really impact and illustrate the opaqueness of the domestic US admissions process when compared to other markets. So, as an example, while high school grades were ranked quite high, standardized test scores such as AP and SAT and ACT were ranked much lower, and even further below positive character attributes and even students' interest in attending the university. And so there is quite a complex process domestically. Students and parents have trouble navigating it because it isn't necessarily clear when and if a student will be admitted because it's not based on test score alone or on grade performance alone. Students that have received very similar grades or even equal test scores may not be admitted to the same universities. And so international universities can offer straightforward admissions processes, and it's really important to drive this point home during the recruitment process to US students, as oftentimes they expect a more qualitative admissions process with hidden factors. It's also helpful to explain to them that those on the road doing the recruitment and attending either high school visits or fairs or meeting with counselors may not be the people reading the admissions and reading the applications. Typically, those doing the recruitment for the US also are application readers and have a say on decisions, and so they may hold a slightly different relationship while they're on the road. So, reiterating if your university does have separate teams to do this, that the process does look slightly different and likely is based on more black and white criteria is quite helpful because it's not necessarily common in the US market.
All right, now let's get into postgraduate funding. So this slide has actually changed a couple times in the last couple weeks, which really shows the point of it. So Grad Plus, which is the program that allowed American graduate students to borrow up to the full cost of attendance with no limit, has been completely eliminated. In its place are hard caps. So those caps are $20,500 US per year and $100,000 US lifetime for most graduate students. And then the next cap is $50,000 per year and $200,000 US lifetime for degrees classified as professional. So the complication is that who counts as professional is currently being fought in federal court. So the Department of Education initially limited the category to 11 fields. Within those 11 fields, notable majors that were excluded were nursing, physician assistant, and therapy programs. On June 24th, a judge struck that decision, um, and now the interim is there is now 29 programs. So it went up from 11 programs to now 29 programs. And nursing was then including in that batch. But things still to be in limbo while 25 states are continuing to litigate. So to put that in perspective, imagine an American nursing applicant this spring, and keep in mind that nursing is the single most popular intended major in this country. Their borrowing limit went from effectively unlimited to 20,500 to $50,000 possibly, all within about 8 weeks. So whatever the courts ultimately decide, the experience for that family is just chaos right now. So as I said earlier, things are a little muddied right now in the process. So there is also a leveling effect since federal loans no longer cover the full cost of attendance at eligible institutions. Every postgraduate family are now being forced to do looking into private funding um, to cover the rest of the cost. So in practical terms, the lack of eligibility just stopped mattering. So again, an institution that can state a fixed, knowable price is not just competitive, it gives the students so much relief, especially in this day and age with just the uncertainty of where federal funding is coming from.
Thanks, Damian. I will prompt everyone to keep what Damian just shared in mind because we will get into some student sentiment data in a while. And I think what he just shared is quite relevant to some of the student sentiment you will hear about in a few minutes. We also want to touch briefly on community college landscape and how this is impacting US recruitment. And so for just all of us to be on the same page and to set the definition, the community college sector and what a community college is it's a public, often 2-year institution that offers an associate degree at typically a fraction of a cost of a full degree, or in many cases free, as more and more states are starting to subsidize community college costs for in-state students. What we see is that typically students will complete their 2 years at a community college and then look to transfer to a 4-year university to finish their bachelor's degree. And more, we're seeing students choose to go this route because of those cost saving measures, especially as we're running into these challenges with federal funding across the states. And community colleges are one of our largest untapped international recruitment channels, and they're playing a critical role as a stepping stone for bachelor's degrees right now for those cost-conscious students, but we're not necessarily seeing our international university partners play in this space to the level they could to successfully recruit these students. 83% of the more than 9 million community college students across the US intend to transfer. And what we're seeing is there's a gap between those that intend to transfer and those that actually do, due to some of the complications that they have about navigating that transfer process. So in California, for example, where they're alone 2.1 of those 9 million community college students, while 83% intend to transfer, only 1 in 5 actually do end up transferring within the system. And many of those students are academically strong, they're financially conscious, and they're actively exploring their international and domestic options to continue. But the challenge is not necessarily the lack of intent, but the lack of clear pathways for how a student can transfer those credits into continuing in the bachelor system. And what we also see is universities that tend to successfully recruit those students have built those clear pipelines and pathways so that students who have completed their associate degree can go on to complete just 2 years more, for example, at a US institution to complete that 4 year degree. A couple of misconceptions I do want to talk about, and as we work, and I know Damien mentioned at the beginning, primarily with UK and Irish institutions, many of whom are Russell Group institutions, so competing directly with some of our Ivy Leagues in the US. One of the misconceptions we constantly hear is that these students likely are academically underprepared or aren't necessarily taking their studies seriously. So why would they be successful? And so, as I said, most of those students do tend to transfer and enroll at a full degree institution, and many of those students are finishing their associate's degree with quite a significantly high GPA. And what we see is for those students that do transfer, 81% of them remain enrolled at their 4 year institution into that second year. And that's compared to the national average of second year retention rate, which is at about 70%. And so there's quite a significant difference of retention when community college students transfer in to complete their degrees. We also see that transfer students submit an average of 2 applications to continue that degree versus the average of 7 for full-time first-time applicants. And so what we're increasingly seeing across the US is as students are applying to more and more first-time students are applying to more and more universities, wait lists are growing, universities are having to admit a higher number of students to hit those enrollment targets, whereas the community college pathway tends to offer a bit more stability because those students are actually applying to fewer universities. I did also want to highlight, Damon, if you can just do me a favor and click to that next slide. I just want to highlight a couple of examples too of some of our top universities that do admit a really significant portion of transfer students. So you could see Berkeley, who is our #1 top public university in the US and #9 in the world, admitted over 5,000 transfer students for last fall of 2025. Cornell University, which is an Ivy, #12 in the States, admitted over 800 transfer admits in the fall of 2024, which is their most recent admit data. And the University of Texas, Austin, again, top public school, top #7 public school in the US, admitted over 2,000 transfer admits. So we're really seeing that top universities in the States are using this pathway effectively and are admitting really significant cohorts of students from the community college space.
All right. So a lot of what we talked about, I like to call was the machine. So now I want to talk about what has been happening inside it over essentially the last 18 months. So the niche survey, what it is that it asks thousands of American high school juniors about their college search. So things like what matters to them, what stresses them out, and what makes a school stand out. This particular data reflects the class of 2026, so the students that are applying right now, and these are their own words. There are three findings that I think you will find most interesting. So the first is filling out, sort of what I mentioned earlier, but filling out a college application now ranks as their second biggest predicted challenge, behind only financial aid. The process itself has become quite a burden. Um, and then second, only to 42% say that brand recognition matters to their decision, which is great news for anyone here whose brand does not yet exist or is not prevalent in the US. These students are more open than the market assumes, and one in five will only consider a school that offers their exact program. So fit is beating out prestige at this particular moment. Third, 40% say that political climate is shaping how they evaluate college. And that's a 22-point jump in a single year. And over half of those students are actively avoiding traditionally conservative states. American 17-year-olds are already crossing state lines over politics and values. So the distance from crossing state lines to crossing oceans is much shorter than it used to be. Also, the support system is thinning. So only 31% of these students meet with their school counselor even once a semester, which is down nearly 20% in a year. And one in five never meets with them at all, including 40% of the highest achievers. Their most trusted source of guidance is now current college students. And there's a real guidance vacuum in the American college search, and an institution with human presence in the market will be the best position to fill that.
In addition to formal surveys that are completed within the market, we have also been tracking changing student sentiment and really focusing on how the 2004 election and subsequent change in administration has impacted our student mobility trends. I'm going to note that all of the data I'm about to share with you is also written into our US outbound mobility report, and we will be sharing the link for that in the chat. And I'm mindful of time, so I will try to move through this quite quickly. I did warn back before we started this that Damian and I could talk about this market for ages. And so I'll move through this so we can make sure I can get it back to Damian for us to wrap up in time. Um, Essentially, what I want to showcase here, and this is important for the rest of the data I'm about to share, because some of the percentages won't look too significantly different. But what's really important to note is that the volume of student voices related to international education and outbound mobility increased significantly from pre-election period to our post-election period. And more importantly, this has been a sustained increase in volume. And so in 2004, immediately after the election, there was a spike in student sentiment and looking for outbound options. And originally, a lot of the press about this spike noted that historically, we've seen these spikes post-election and they tend to die out quite quickly. They don't always result in increased outbound applications or increased outbound mobility. What we have noticed after this change in administration is this has been sustained, and we have seen an increase in both application and enrollment to outbound destinations. And so this really is a different and pivotal moment for the US as we're seeing that student sentiment is changing and is changing in a way that is meaningful and lasting. And so, pre-election, a couple things I'll highlight is that social media mentions for outbound mobility tend to be advice-seeking behavior. So, tended to be students asking for budgeting advice, transferability of credits that they may have already attained in the US, and cultural questions about the destinations they were considering. Whereas post-election, a lot of these posts are now more emotionally charged. And we're also seeing that they're really surrounding this conversation around escaping the US through an education abroad. They might be looking to change location because of political prospects. And also, we're seeing students increasingly concerned around brain drain. So, in addition to posts around outbound mobility, so Damien, I'll have you switch to the next slide, please. The sentiment has also changed in terms of positive versus negative emotion and reason for looking for outbound mobility. And so what we've seen is that negativity has increased pretty significantly in the tone of posts after the election. And so pre-election, the negativity, and while it hasn't increased, like I said, too significantly, it's the type of negativity that we've picked up on in these posts that matters most. So pre-election, the negativity was around the financial constraints, comparing the value of a degree within the US and outside of the US, and then navigating the rules around international study and some of the complexities that come with that. Whereas again, post-election, the negative mentions are typically around fear, and fear of the increasingly authoritarian political landscape, reevaluating options for education, and thinking forward about brain drain from the US and how this might impact a student's experience in the US with particular programs. We see that while negativity increases, I also want to touch on this second chart on the bottom here. We're also seeing that in terms of emotional tone of post, sadness, while it didn't increase in terms of percentage of type of post, it was still the dominant emotion, and the volume of posts, like I said in that previous slide, increased significantly. So while it's hovered around 30% of the tone, the number of posts in this category has increased significantly. And again, we are hearing that this has changed. Pre-election, it was about missing the US during study abroad, unhappiness about financial situations, or doubts about career prospects. Whereas post-election, this has switched to the US being a nation in decline, talking about academic talent leaving the states, and then subsequently the impacts of these phenomena on US academia. Disproportionately, we're seeing that financial anxiety is being listed, and that the political climate is being listed as students are talking about why they want to leave the US. So, generally speaking, we've kind of listed this for you. The pre-election themes and post-election themes are moving from financial constraints, comparing the values of degrees, to really fears around the political landscape in the US and evaluating the value of education that a student can get in the US. And then finally, we can see quite bluntly how this has varied from how often the political climate was mentioned before the election and post-election. And so, really, what this means for Australia and New Zealand and where we can capitalize here is that a lot of the challenges and concerns students are listing in these posts can be met by the offering of international universities. And so, as an example, the lifestyle, the safety, and the quality of life is really important to students in articulating how this lasting kind of offer is there. One of the examples we've heard quite significantly and quite frequently from our other international partners is around the sustainability of student support services on campus. So recently, there has been a lot of different interpretation in the States around how diversity can be funded in the US. Unfortunately, as a result, oftentimes what universities have now done due to some of our new restrictions is they've removed any programs from campus that could be considered as funding programs that support diversity, which means that centers like LGBTQ centers, international centers, or even centers for specific populations of students are being removed. And so, one area we've seen partners come in and really positively position themselves is by saying that any resources they have for students are going to last over the next 5 to 10 years, because a lot of the US competitors are not able to offer that same consistency at the moment. International universities are also being perceived at the moment as just a fresh start. So these are some of the pull factors our international partners can offer. I do also want to talk quickly, though, on the fact that this still really does have to do with the push factors. So, Damien, if you can do me a favor and jump to our strategic lenses so I can hand it back to you with at least a few minutes for you to wrap up, um, is really the point here is that increasingly we're seeing this be about push factors rather than pull factors. And so, what the kind of three main themes of this data are is that students are making decisions earlier, faster, and more emotionally. And so we're seeing decision making windows compress and really this become a more emotional process for students. And so while it was always high touch, we're seeing that universities have to be more involved with students and more assuring about the support systems on campus that will be sustained. We're also seeing that the perception of stability now outranks the policy detail. So, this is interpreted often by students socially, not communicated technically. So, being able to provide alumni examples, having students meet with current student ambassadors who can attest to the fact that they've had positive experiences on campus is really more important to the recruitment process than being able to articulate an actual technical policy of the country or of the university. And finally, we just want to note that these pull factors are really converging across destinations. And so, even though there are geographic differences in a lot of the most popular outbound mobility or outbound destinations for US students, the same pull factors are really recurring here. So, we're seeing safety and personal freedom, affordability relative to the US, credible work study, post-study work options, and then cultural openness and belonging, especially for students from minoritized communities that may not feel that sense of belonging currently in the States. And so, really, we're seeing the destinations are competing on trust, and trust is really hard to measure, and it takes time to build that in the US market. This is, as we've touched upon a number of times throughout this presentation, it's a relationship driven market, and we're seeing that really matter. And so, counselors that have positive relationships with universities that trust that their students will be taken care of at a time where they don't always feel those same resources exist in the US, this is where our university partners are competing very aggressively at the moment to get US students.
All right. So to close, we're going to close by looking at what the enrollment data already shows because um, the answer is that it's showing a lot and it has already reached some of your shores. So let's start with your own government numbers. So Australian higher education students visas granted to US citizens rose 36.5% year over year. And that happened while English and financial thresholds were tight. tightening. New Zealand was up 11%, and I want to stress that this growth happened before any targeted recruitment had begun. Nobody was really trying yet. And the third box is a benchmark where a record of 23,565 Americans are enrolled in UK universities, with applications up 14%. The UK did not win that because it has a better product than you do. It won because it was just organized and present with people in the market. And you saw earlier what that looks like for a single institution. So the playbook is proven and it's repeatable. So this is not necessarily a 300 student a year market for any single use institution, but it is a high value diversification market, measured in dozens, especially to start. Australia accounts for fewer than 10% of destination mentions in US outbound conversations, while New Zealand account for fewer than 4%. Yet demand for both destinations is growing rapidly. So that combination, strong growth and limited competition for attention, creates such a clear opportunity for the institutions that enter the market early. And I am conscious of time too, so I'm trying to get through these. For anyone who needs to make this case, internally, the outcomes hold up pretty well. So 90% of graduates with international study experience say it mattered to their career success, and nearly a quarter say it directly helped them land their first job. Across four major business schools, alumni with international experience earn an average of $4,100 US more um, in their first job, regardless of their grades. And international experience is also linked with faster promotion into management across IT, education, healthcare, and finance. So, in other words, recruiting American students is defensible based on what happens to the students, not just revenue as well. And then I want to close by sort of addressing objections we hear the most often because each one has been, I think, has been answered in the last hour. But the first one is that U.S. students are not interested in full degrees. The sentiment search and visa data that you have seen today says otherwise. And the July intake removes the gap year excuse entirely. The second is that recruiting in the U.S. is too expensive. That is true if you hire your own American team. It is not true fractionally. You saw what one institution achieved with two in-country representatives, and our UK partners with representatives in the market have grown their North American recruitment by 20 to 40%. Third is that your growth setting is that your growth setting make expansion harder to plan, but they also make the right students more valuable. When every commencement place matters, a self-funded, low visa risk American student from outside the top five source countries is exactly the kind of enrollment managed systems should prioritize. Fourth challenge is that FAFSA administration can be costly with no guaranteed return. As we discussed earlier, choosing not to participate can be a deliberate strategy, actually. And for many families, clear pricing and visible scholarships offers can make the pressure and eligibility funding that they may never even use it. And then finally, the enrollment cliff, the decline of the number of American 18-year-olds is real, but that does not mean overall student market is disappearing. This generation is still choosing higher education in record numbers, which is helping offset that demographic decline. All right, and I'll throw it back to close.
Thank you so much, Damian and Katie. I know it's very early in the morning for you both, and so really appreciate the time that you spent with my Australian and New Zealand colleagues. We did have a number of questions come through, but I am cognizant of time, so I know some people might drop off. I'll just read out one of the questions around the community colleges. They said, this seems like a quick win. What would you recommend for an Australian university to do as a first step to tap into this recruitment channel?
That's a great question. We really recommend starting with very specific program to program opportunities. And so making sure this is mapped for a faculty or for a specific program where you have the school buy-in, and where you're going to get the faculty that will take the time to map the courses. It does take time to ensure that students can enter at that year three and ensure they only have 2 years left. That's where it becomes competitive. So if it's not mapped appropriately and students will have to do more years outside of the US than in the US, they won't be interested in the opportunity. So really ensuring that this is mapped effectively and students can transfer as many credits as possible and have 2 years maximum to give them an opportunity to complete that degree is important. We also find that by doing that sort of cohort model, you're able to build alumni up quicker and student ambassadors up quicker to go back and promote that same program to community colleges, in whatever area it may be that you're targeting. So, as an example, we've seen what's worked really well is there is an Australian university that has targeted California community colleges, for a marine biology program, and they've had really great and quick success because they focus on program to program specific matching and have slowly started to build that out. But by building it from one program to begin, they're able to see those quick wins, and really focus the work more effectively.
Thanks, Katie. I'm noticing
Of
a couple
course.
of people having to drop off, so we probably are calling it for time. If people do have any questions, you do have my email from which the invitation for this event came out on, but also Katie has popped in Damian's details in LinkedIn, so please feel free to connect with him. As I mentioned at the start, he'll be here for AIEC, so please give him a warm welcome when he does arrive as well. We've covered a lot today, community colleges, federal funding, a whole range of stuff that's going to help Australian and New Zealand institutions formulate their US recruitment strategy. So I want to thank you both, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks.
for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.